Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying healthy. Hope you're staying sane as much as that can be possible right now. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so encouraging and supportive through this whole process of mine of creating my first novel. I've never done anything like this before. I've written a lot of plays, as you know, but writing long-form prose is not something I had done until now. So this has been a fun challenge and a learning curve. Now, we're in for a treat this week because I will be sharing with you 3 different excerpts from various points in the current manuscript. Now, up until this point, I've been very reticent about sharing really much at all beyond the most superficial information about the story. Because writing a first draft, it's a really personal process and a solitary process, and I think it needs to be that. But we're at a point right now with all that's going on in the world where I felt that there are certain things thematically in this story that really resonate to what's happening in the world right now, what we're dealing with. And I wanted to share a couple of those sections from the story with you this week. Now, a few things. When I write, my natural tendency is to edit as I go, and that is something I have had to let go of when working on this. I have done some editing while going along, but I've really had to let go of that tendency because otherwise I would never finish a first draft. And I still don't have a first draft finished. There's still a lot that needs to be filled in and fleshed out and pared down and shaped. But the sections that I'll be sharing this week they're rough. There are a lot of places where I have marked in my manuscript. I'll have brackets around certain things that I'm not real happy with that I know I want to revisit and probably replace or rephrase or cut. But I can't focus too much on that right now. So a lot of what you'll be hearing, there'll be places where you might be like, ooh, why did he say that? He said the same thing 3 times. And yes, I did say the same thing 3 times. And I can't put too much energy on that right now, fixing it, because I need to get through it and then see the work as a whole and then see where it works best to have a certain thing or to reveal a certain piece of information or to describe the detail or what level of detail, that kind of thing. So I know I have some writer friends out here who may be watching this where there's a tendency to always want to impart your wisdom or opinion on how something should be improved upon. That's not really what this is for. So hold off on those tendencies, please. This is more to share the content rather than the polished form. Because I think thematically, the thread of the story, the spine of the story is the need to connect, to find a meaningful communication and connection that exists without judgment. That really drives the story thematically and dramatically. And I want to share a few places where that especially comes to light. The other thing that some of you may be wondering is how autobiographical is the story and why didn't you think of writing this as a memoir? Those are good questions. I say that this is a roman-a-clef, meaning that the events are mostly real or inspired by real things. The characters are stand-ins for real people with different names. And a memoir, I actually did wrestle with this a little bit of whether I should write this as a memoir or not. A memoir, there's a pact that the author makes with the reader that generally 80%, if you have to be at least 80% certain that what you write is the truth as you believe it to be. And I didn't want to behold myself to that. I didn't want to feel locked into that. And I wanted to feel free that I could fictionalize something if I needed to. And in fact, as much as I have attempted to write the truth as much as possible, there are some things that even my memory, I would write something very inconsequential to the plot. And I would write it the way I remembered it, like the timing of when something happened. And then I later would go back to my journal that I wrote contemporaneously to when the events actually happened and found, this thing actually happened the next morning. It didn't happen that night, kind of things. Nothing that affected the plot in any way at all. But even something like that, to me, I feel like I would need to be so beholden to the truth, to that level of detail, and I needed to let go of that. So that's one reason to write it as a work of fiction or a roman-a-clef. And I just think the story itself works better, in my opinion, presented as a work of fiction rather than as a memoir. A memoir tends to need to follow a certain theme, or the anecdotes go back to a certain theme. And I did not want to write my story quite that way. I don't think it's quite that kind of story, so that's why I'm writing it as a work of fiction. And I can change things if I want to, and I have changed certain things. For example, my alter ego, Jeremy, in the story, he is a writer of prose, or an aspiring fiction and short story and novel writer, as opposed to a playwright. There are some things that I did not change because they're more backdrops to the plot rather than anything that directly affects the plot. For example, in the first part of the story, we learn that Jeremy is going back to Massachusetts to music direct a production of The World Goes Round, which in fact I did in the spring of 2016. And the events that happen kind of with that as the backdrop. The fact that it was The World Goes Round, there was nothing that happened specifically with The World Goes Round affected the plot. It was just the circumstances. And there are some connections with the music in that show that I really liked in life and wanted to connect it with the novel. So that's one thing that I did not change. So that just gives you an idea of kind of how I'm going with fiction and why fiction and why not a memoir, and why are some things changed and not others. The other thing that, I'm sorry, I'm kind of blabbing a little bit on this intro. I'll keep the other ones shorter, but I want to give you a little bit of a background before we jump in. Some of you may, not so much with today's excerpt, but with tomorrow's and Wednesday's, you may wonder, this sounds a lot like Nate's play, Some Kind of Blue. And you would be right. Some Kind of Blue, for those who don't know, is a play that I wrote in December 2016, January 2017. Refined it. I did a public reading of it up in Massachusetts in June of 2017. And it was a second rounder at the Austin Film Festival Playwrights Competition in 2018. Anyway, Some Kind of Blue, I had to fictionalize a great deal in that play. For one thing, the real-life events that inspired that play had not found a resolution yet. So I kind of had to manufacture a resolution. And that play also is essentially told from a different character's perspective. My alter ego character in that play is a supporting role, whereas in the Jeremy Chronicles, it's Jeremy's point of view and Jeremy's story. And I fictionalized a lot with the timeline. The timeline of when things happened are very different in that play. And it didn't bother me. I mean, it's a play. It needed to be fictionalized to that degree for that medium and from that point of view. But it kind of bothered me that internally that the truth from my point of view wasn't laid out on paper. So that's kind of what this story does. And another thing that is I kind of tried to do with this, when I did my staged reading of Some Kind of Blue in June of 2017, one of my colleagues up in Massachusetts, Susan Nest, said during the talkback that the character that is my stand-in just felt too perfect. And which was a valid note. But somebody else at the talkback said also a very valid observation. Yes, but this play isn't from that character's perspective. This play is a different character's memory of my alter ego. And we only see certain sides of that in that play. And I don't think that I'm perfect. I don't think the character is perfect. But you're only seeing certain sides of it. So I thought to address Susan's note, I would present it from my point of view, where my character, Jeremy, is not perfect and does some things that are a little bit unconventional, a little bit unorthodox, that the ends justify the means, but there are some things that Jeremy does that are not perfect. So I hope, Susan, I address that note in this novel. So, just to set up a little bit, I'm going to finish the blab so we can hear. Actually, I'm going to read 2 excerpts today, so that's a surprise little treat. They kind of connect, but they're not concurrent with each other. The book, by the way, is structured into 5 parts. Part 1, each of the parts have a title. Part 1, the title of part 1 is Rebirth. It's about rebirth and starting over, which is another theme that runs through the play. Runs through the novel, rather. I'm sorry. And so what happens? The given circumstances. Jeremy, at the very beginning of the novel, has just amicably ended a 3-year relationship and is newly single, and he is leaving. He has just left his soul-crushing retail job to take a 3-month job in Massachusetts. Jeremy lives in Atlanta. Sound familiar? And this job opportunity, it's in his field. He's going up to music director. Production of The World goes round. This is the part that's still true. And it's starting over for him. He was in a job that he hated and doesn't want to leave home and go back to live in his parents' house for 3 months, but it's kind of something he has to do in order to get his life back in the direction that he wants it to go. So he's very ambivalent about it. He's excited to be working in his field, but not excited about leaving what he has made as his home in Atlanta to go back to his parents' house and live in his parents' house for an extended period of time. So part one is Jeremy's preparations to make this trip from Massachusetts, or to Massachusetts from Georgia. And after his breakup, there are a bunch of things that he just kind of needs to do for himself, just to start over and clean the slate. And Jeremy is a part of a writer's group in Atlanta. Jeremy, the character of Jeremy, writes short stories and novellas and maybe a novel. The roman-a-clef part of it. So, this little excerpt I want to share, this is a little short one. This happens, actually, it's on page 30 of my current draft of the manuscript. It's very early on in the story. This is a scene that actually did happen, and this is the one time that I used an actual name. So Kerwin Thompson, you inspired this little scene, and you unwittingly introduced one of the threads that carries through the novel. So I hope you don't mind if I use your name in this. Here we go. After writer's group, a bunch of us went out for a late-night meal and drinks at a local eatery near the railroad tracks, a few blocks away from downtown Decatur. It was one of those small, contemporarily quaint establishments in a repurposed factory building, brought to new life in a rapidly gentrifying area. About a dozen of us gathered around 3 tables that had been pushed together. Andy sat to my left, and we ordered our drinks and food. As usual, overly cautious in my effort to reduce the possibility of being pulled over on the drive home, I avoided alcohol entirely, ordering a ginger ale instead. Once our drinks had been served and all of our food orders had been taken, Kerwin, one of the writers who joined us that night, posed a question for the table. What is a word that you absolutely hate? Each writer offered his or her contribution, usually providing some sort of reason or story behind the negative connotation associated with his or her chosen word. Being seated toward the end of the makeshift circle, I was among the last to be called upon. Obsessive. Obsessive. Kerwin repeated, echoing my word with his mellifluous, ponderous tone. And what about obsessive do you hate so much? I could have run a blue streak in a passionate diatribe full of rants and disjointed stream of consciousness ramblings, but I managed to keep myself in check. Because it's so often used to mean something bad. If you're passionate about something, you're obsessive. If you're an expert at something, you're obsessive. We use that word as if it is a bad thing, but we should want to be obsessive about the things that we like. We should want to be obsessive about the things that we study. We should want to be obsessive about the things that we are passionate about. All my life I've heard, you're being obsessive. Don't be obsessive. Stop being obsessive. I hate that word. It's overused. It's used to mean something bad when it shouldn't be anything bad at all. Interesting, Kerwin replied with neither judgment nor finality, merely pondering the idea, newly articulated, that he had never before considered. So, you are obsessed with hating the word obsessive, he added lightly in jest, aware that it wasn't much of a joke, but rather a punctuation to my mildly theatrical explanation. So that was a little anecdote that actually did happen, and Kerwin, I think you unwittingly inspired a thread that can be carried through the whole novel in that moment. So I hope you don't mind if I used your name. This excerpt, this is a longer excerpt. This comes from a little bit later in part 1. So what happens later. So we have he goes to his writers group and they go out for food and drink after. And during this time, Jeremy, he knows he's going to be leaving home for 3 months in a matter of a week. And he's newly single and he needs to just kind of find himself, he needs that time to himself. That's what I'm trying to say. So Jeremy takes a rather spontaneous drive out to visit a friend in Wichita, Kansas. It's just kind of I'm single, I need to hang out, I need to get away for a few days, and I'm going to see my friend Tyler in Wichita. And all the while, Jeremy, he's kind of having some feelings for a friend who he met through his writers group named Andy. And Jeremy has kind of had a hard time reading Andy, and he thinks there could be something there. They seem to have a lot in common, but he doesn't really know how to approach it. And another thing that kind of runs through this that I hope a lot of people may relate to is in terms of making a connection. Jeremy tends to second guess himself. He has a lot of, I don't like to say demons. He doesn't have a lot of demons, but he does have a lot of ghosts that he has to contend with and wrestle with that prevent him sometimes from taking that step to make the connection because he's afraid of getting hurt and because of things from his past and incidents from his past and certain people who have judged him in his past. He kind of gets in his own way. And this is an example where he wrestles with that because he wants to make a connection with Andy and deepen the connection that he's already kind of established with Andy, but he's not sure if Andy feels the same way. He's not sure if what he does is going to push Andy away, and Jeremy tries to get out of his own way, but he wrestles with it, and this is a section that I hope some of you can relate to, especially now, or if you've always struggled with it or had problems in your own life, I hope this might help you. So, the given circumstances, Jeremy is in Wichita. He's visited his friend Tyler the night before he drives back to Atlanta. He and Tyler go out, and then Jeremy the next morning drives back and struggles with how is he going to take the next step that he needs to take to see what can happen or not happen with Andy. So here we go. Over our late night dinner, I attempted to explain to Tyler my situation with Andy, but the noise of the bar, the cramped atmosphere, the loud cacophony of the many television sets broadcasting 8 different sports networks and simultaneous discordancy made for a trying conversation and a migraine inevitable. We finished our food, and the cool nighttime air became an overwhelming antidote to the claustrophobic quarters of the sports bar. My headache led to mild nausea, a combination of the stress of the noisy sports bar and the anxious anticipation of needing to talk to Andy. As Tyler drove me back to my car, I furnished him with more details about my accumulating feelings toward Andy, and Tyler agreed that my plans to call Andy tomorrow to ask him out to dinner as friends would be indeed constructive. I think I'm going to call him tomorrow afternoon on my way back home, I explained. I'll just start it out casual, talk about writing and ask him about the work he's done on his short story. And then I'll ask if he's doing anything on Sunday, and if he's free, I'll ask him if he wants to join me for dinner. I think that sounds like a good plan. Keep it open, don't put strings on it, and just see what happens. I was grateful to have someone who understood, who could offer advice and encouragement, without making it feel like a check-in with a psychologist. My headache abated slightly as we reached the street where my car was parked. Tyler and I finished our conversation as we sat in his car adjacent from where I had parked. He gave me a final hug of encouragement before I got out of the passenger seat and slowly made my way back to my car, waving him goodbye and enjoying the cool, crisp night air. I returned to my hotel, enjoyed a nice hot shower, and responded to an email from a colleague from the writers group who had just offered me lengthy, somewhat unsolicited feedback on my novella before I settled down for the night. I slept in as late as possible before checkout time in order to be fully rested and ready for the full day's drive that awaited. I left Wichita a little before noon and made good time up Interstate 35, through the Flint Hills and up to Emporia. I stopped for lunch at a Brahms in Olathe and internally debated over the perfect time to make that call to Andy. Evening made the most sense. He would be off work, and by that time I would most likely be driving through St. Louis Friday night rush hour, a perfect opportunity to distract from the tedious logjam and finally have that talk. Yes, I would call Andy once I hit St. Louis. I finished my lunch and got back on the highway, preparing to cross the state of Missouri. I knew from my previous travels that this should take about 3.5 hours, including rest stops, and by the time I reached St. Louis, it would be time to call Andy. I don't know why I was so nervous. After all, this was just a call to say hi, to ask him about how his writing was going, and to ask if he wanted to join me for dinner on Sunday night. It wasn't like I would be asking him out on a date, although in truth I kind of was. Just the fact that I would be calling him on the phone could have given him reason to pause. We had never talked on the phone before, and who calls people on the phone anymore anyway? Why couldn't I send a text, send an email, send him a message on Facebook? Maybe I was nervous because I would be calling him on the phone. Would he think that I'm weird? Would he think that I'm crazy? Would he think that I am, yes, that word again, obsessive? Would calling him on the phone be crossing a line that would not be crossed if I were to send him a text or an email or a Facebook message? By around 4:30 p.m. local time, 5:30 p.m. in Atlanta, I had reached the western exurbs of St. Louis. I stopped at a rest area to use the facilities and to stretch my legs before facing the unknown gridlock of the city ahead. I prepared myself to call Andy. The time was fast approaching, and it was neither too early nor too late to reasonably make such a call. I was still a little ways out from the St. Louis metropolis, and I had not yet reached the rush hour traffic that I was anticipating. There is still a little time before I really need to make that call, I thought to myself, as if my self-imposed time frame needed to be followed to the letter if there was to be any hope for success. And besides, it was just beginning to sprinkle, a more intense downpour imminent on the horizon. Within the hour, I was in downtown St. Louis, or at least the downtown area as passed through on Interstate 70. Traffic was lighter than I had expected, and as there were no major standstill pockets of traffic, there was no real opportunity to pull out the phone and dial Andy's number. I soon made it across the Mississippi River and into Illinois without ever picking up the phone and making that fateful call. I stopped for dinner at a Five Guys a few exits after the bridge and decided that there, in the parking lot, I would make that call just as soon as I finished my dinner. I needed to be well fed before this conversation. Why risk losing an appetite should the conversation not go as desired, only to develop an intense hunger headache to be endured for the remainder of the drive back to Atlanta? I scarfed down my double cheeseburger and got back into my car. Now is the time. If not now, when? I pulled out of the Five Guys parking lot, returned to the interstate, and called Andy. After a few rings, his voicemail picked up, his southern sassiness speeding through almost to the point of incomprehensibility. Hey, it's Andy. I never answer my phone, but if you need to talk to me, just hang up and send a text. Who leaves voicemails anymore anyway? Okay, thanks. Bye. Hi, Andy. It's Jer. I'm driving right now, so I can't text. I just took a spontaneous trip to Wichita, and I'm on my way home now, so I thought I'd give you a call to say hi and see how you're doing. If you want to give me a call back, I'll be on the road until 2 or 3 in the morning, and any chance I can get to break up the drive will be much appreciated. Anyway, I hope you're doing well, and give me a call if you get a chance. I'll talk to you later. Bye. I figured that the chances of Andy calling back sat comfortably at 50%, maybe 40%. He clearly did not like talking on the phone, but perhaps the fact that he knew that I couldn't text might sway him to make an exception to his aversion. The rain had abated, and the dark clouds made way for a pleasant resurgence of blue sky and late evening sun before twilight cast its shadows on the flat but surprisingly pretty surrounding farmland. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Andy. Hey, Andy, how are you doing? The service on his end was a little shaky, and I was unable to make out every word he said. Not the best situation to ask him out on a date, but I had to do what I had to do with what I had to deal with. I'm doing well. I loved the fact that he knew the difference between well and good and knew how to use each properly. Work was crazy today, and I kind of got into an argument with my boss because they had me in the freezers all day, he continued as he regaled me with the day's latest drama, myself only able to understand about 2/3 of his diatribe. I listened patiently, asking him to repeat any seemingly important parts that were lost due to the connection, and I waited for the opportune moment to broach the real subject of the call. He talked about his short story, telling me about his latest revisions, asking me my opinion on the rewrite. I shared with him the gist of the lengthy email I received the night before about my novella, and we laughed and commiserated about the presumptuousness of some writers who need to impart their unsolicited elder-splaining upon their younger fellow writers. In Mount Vernon, I merged onto Interstate 57 from Interstate 64 and continued on the drive south, the reception improving as I made it through the interchange. The final hour of sunset, a calm, reassuring glow, warmed the southern Illinois countryside as Andy and I continued our chat. The moment of reckoning was at last apace. Do you have anything going on Sunday afternoon? No, I don't. Wow, what's up? Well, I was wondering if you wanted to meet up for dinner on Sunday. Yeah, sure. What were you thinking? His reply was immediate and without any discernible hesitation. Well, I could come down your way if you want. You know the places down there. Is there someplace good to eat that you'd recommend? Yeah, there's a couple of places nearby. We could go to the Brake Pad. It's a really cool place a couple blocks from my house. Sure, that sounds great. So it's a date? It's a date. Even if he didn't think of it as a date in the traditional sense of the word had now been dropped. The fact that Andy displayed zero misgivings in considering my proposal boded well. Working in the theater, I like to believe that I have become decent at reading subtext through intonation, and in his tone I could discern no subtext of, I'd rather not, but I'm going to be polite and just say yes for the time being. Could I have been fretting all day about this conversation for nothing? Did I delay this phone call unnecessarily when all along he would have jumped at the chance to say yes to a date? A casual grab-a-bite-to-eat date, but a date on Sunday evening? Have the voices in my head, the voices of my childhood, my adolescence, telling me to stop obsessing, that it's obsessive to think about making a connection like this, been standing in my way all these years, preventing God knows how many connections from ever happening? How many connections, how many opportunities have I missed in my life because the voices from my past were reverberating loud and clear? You're being obsessive, Jeremy. Don't be obsessive, Jeremy. Stop being obsessive, Jeremy. Okay. So that is from part 1, Rebirth. Thank you for reading or watching if you've gotten this far. Thank you so much. Tomorrow, I'll be sharing a video of an excerpt from part 2. The title of part 2 that I give, I give all the parts titles, but I don't know if I said that. Andre Aciman does that in Call Me By Your Name. That novel is in 4 parts with titles to each part, but no specific numbered chapters beyond that. Anyway, part 1 is called Rebirth. Part 2 is called People Like Us Have Got to Stick Together. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay well. We'll see you on the other side. Bye-bye.